Maybe magic once was a mighty force in the world. But not anymore. The dragons are gone. The giants are dead. And the children of the forest forgotten.
Come with me, Brandon Stark.
Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Game of Thrones Season 4, Episode 10, The Children. Now, I'm making this review about 2 weeks after this episode aired. As I stated in my last video, I was on vacation in the US visiting my family, and I didn't have time to make a video. I was hoping to do a discussion video with my brother, who's also a huge Game of Thrones fan, but we didn't have the proper equipment or the time, so unfortunately it never happened. However, he did do his own review of all of Season 4, so I'll post a link to that video in the description because I really agree with a lot of what he said. But I'll be doing my own review of Season 4 eventually. However, I wanted to cover the season finale first. A little disclaimer, I usually try keeping the video down to 20 minutes or less, but since this week is the finale, I'm not going to worry about time. I'm just going to go for it, and this will take however long it takes to cover the episode, so this could end up being a long video. So I had about 3 weeks to digest this episode, or about 2 weeks, and I've come to the conclusion that this is one of the best, if not best, episodes of the season, and perhaps the entire series. There are aspects of this episode that I'm not too happy about, which I'll get into later. But overall, this was a fantastic episode. One of the darkest episodes of the entire series. This episode was just filled to the brim with poignant and epic scenes. Every scene in this episode was vital and wonderfully done. There wasn't a moment where I thought it was filler or waste of time, like pretty much every episode has, but this episode had none of that. This is not a typical season finale of Game of Thrones, which tends to be a slow-paced wrap-up of the big events that happened in the previous 2 episodes. Instead, this season, they purposely withheld the conclusions of all the storylines until this episode to give the big conclusion of each one. The 2 exceptions being the Sansa and Littlefinger storyline and the Reek and Ramsay Snow, now Bolton, storyline that were wrapped up in Episode 8. I dare say, though, the conclusions to those stories weren't as grand as the ones concluded in this episode, so they essentially saved the best for last. So we start the episode with the conclusion to the Siege of the Wall storyline, where Jon Snow goes on a mission to kill Mance Rayder under the guise of negotiation. I must say that I don't understand why this scene was in this episode, not the previous episode. It seems to me that even though this isn't a part of the specific battle, it is wrapping up the storyline, and it would have made much more sense as the ending of Episode 9 rather than the beginning of Episode 10. One of my biggest complaints about Episode 9 was that it did not come to a conclusion, and it kind of left you hanging. Whereas Episode 10, they gave you the conclusion right away. But I was kind of out of it having to wait a week. I thought it would have been much more powerful to me had I seen this at the end of the huge battle sequence. I mean, Episode 9 was 10 minutes shorter than the usual episode, and Episode 10 was 10 minutes longer, and so it would have seemed to make perfect sense to me had they had those 10 minutes in Episode 9. The whole thing would have fit so much better with that episode. To me, doing it this way would be like if during the fight between Oberyn and the Mountain, they ended the episode right in the middle of the fight, and then next week's episode started with the conclusion of the fight where the Mountain squishes Oberyn's head. It wouldn't have the same impact on me, and this scene didn't either. So right before I saw this episode, I finished reading book 3. So a lot of the book was still fresh in my mind, so I noticed the differences a lot. And I have to say that the battle sequence with Stannis attacking the wildlings was much more powerful in the books, where Melisandre burned this bird alive that a warg was using to spy, and the warg freaked out, of course, and there was an actual battle in which Mance Rayder actually got away. So this, by comparison, was much quicker, not quite as epic, but it was still cool to see. Overall, I loved this whole sequence, from Jon and Mance's conversation to Stannis attacking the wildlings. A lot of reviewers pointed out that the cinematography in this sequence was amazing. However, it didn't look like there were 100,000 wildlings, but whatever. The other thing about the sequence was I really got on Mance Rayder's side, because all he wants to do is save his people from the coming threat of the White Walkers. He's just kind of going about it the wrong way. For the first couple of seasons of the show, I was really confused about the relationship between the wildlings and the White Walkers. I'm sure at one stage I thought they were on the same side. But they kind of mentioned in season 3 that the wildlings were just as afraid of the White Walkers, and in this episode they made it crystal clear. So in the next scene we see Qyburn promising to turn the mountain into some sort of Frankenstein creature, and I must say this is one of the scenes I did not like. I frankly had enough of the mountain and would rather they just killed him off. I'm a bit irritated that the show chose to follow the books in this storyline, but not another one in which many book readers were upset that the show didn't do. I would have much rather seen that than this. Another thing that's disappointing is that the mountain didn't suffer as much in the show as he did in the books. In the books, he was constantly screaming. His screams could be heard all over King's Landing. Milk of the Poppy did nothing for him. Other drugs didn't help him. Any leeches they put on him would just die. His blood turned all black. And they left all of this out, or they downplayed it. And I think it was really disappointing to all the fans of Oberyn who were upset over his gruesome death. I think seeing the mountain suffer would have at least made it better for all those people who were upset over Oberyn's death. But they couldn't even do that. So overall, I was not a fan of this scene. However, the next scene I loved, and that was where we see Cersei telling her father that under no circumstance will she marry Sir Loras, and that she'd destroy the Lannister family name if he forced her to marry him. This scene was awesome. It was another huge departure from the books, but since Tywin died shortly after, ultimately it won't affect things. But it was really cool to see Tywin, who always had the upper hand with his children, get defeated by one of them, and then of course later on in the episode he gets defeated by another one of his children in a more permanent manner. But yeah, in the books she wasn't betrothed to anyone in particular, but Tywin did insist she should be married. But at this point it was still, they were still looking for a husband. He was even considering people like Oberyn Martell or Balon Greyjoy. But I love this change in the show. I think it's a major step in Cersei's character that will affect her going on into season 5, because it's all about her taking power. And now that Tywin's dead, she's going to have all the power, and that will be cool to see. So next we get the scene with Jaime and Cersei. And not to be one of those people who are constantly bringing up the books, but in the books, Jaime rejects Cersei, but here he fully accepts her. That and other things that happened in the books but not in the show made the relationship very turbulent. So that means the show might take a very different direction for season 5 with Jaime and Cersei's relationship. Either that, or they will find another reason to cause turbulence in their relationship. So next we get to Daenerys, where a former slave is demanding to be a slave again. This scene was a variation of a scene that happened in book 3, and I actually liked the show's version better. In the books, I kind of thought Dany's reaction was a bit shitty and out of character for her, whereas here I thought she did the best that she could do. But from there we go into the scene where it's evident that Dany's dragons are out of control. And I gotta say, in a vital episode with 4 major deaths, I have to say the saddest part of this whole episode for me was when Daenerys locked up her dragons. It was so heartbreaking. I do believe I shed a tear when I first saw this. Anyway, this is further evidence that Dany is on a downward spiral. First, killing all those masters, whether they deserved it or not. Then leaving Astapor and Yunkai unprotected, so they could simply fall again. And then that folly with playing right into Tywin's hands by dismissing Jorah. And now this. Locking up her best assets, the dragons, in some dark dungeon, when in fact these dragons did nothing wrong. It was that other one that wasn't even there. So she's totally fucking up. And I predict in season 5 things are going to go very badly for her. And this isn't based off of any books or anything like that. I'm just basing off what I'm seeing here. And yeah, she's not not doing a very good job of being queen. So then we get another scene with Melisandre making eyes at Jon Snow through the fire. A lot of people are making a huge deal out of this. Personally, I think they're just foreshadowing something that happens at the end of book 3 that's not that big of a deal. And then we get Jon Snow going off to burn Ygritte north of the wall. I thought this was a very touching, very necessary scene that ties up the tragic love story of Jon Snow and Ygritte. So then we come to Bran finally arriving at the Heart Tree, and I got to say I love this scene. I heard a lot of people complaining about this scene, but I loved it. The complaints were it was too fantasy, they were going over the top with the fantasy elements, but I think that's a ridiculous argument. I mean, there's dragons, there's giants, there's White Walkers. You've seen all the people coming back from the dead. Melisandre giving birth to smoke babies that go and kill people. But you're upset with a child throwing fireballs? It's ridiculous. I totally don't get that argument. But anyway, I say this because I'm a fantasy lover anyway. But even if you're not a fantasy lover, you have no problem with vagina monsters, but you have a problem with fireballs throwing out. I don't know. I don't get it. But anyway, I love this scene a lot. It was more exciting and more action-packed than I expected it to be. In fact, whenever I see Bran, my first reactions would be like, oh no, it's Bran again. Prepare to be bored. But this wasn't boring at all. In fact, this scene was amazing. First, we get to Bran walking to Hodor to fight off some skeletons, then the tragic death of Jojen, and then we finally meet one of the children of the forest as she shoots fireballs at the skeletons, and also we finally get to see the three-eyed raven. This is something that they've been teasing since season 1, and to finally get some payoff with this was awesome. So let me talk a little bit about the children of the forest, because there have been some confusion from non-book readers about who they are. In fact, I do think that the show didn't explain this very well. However, most of what I know about the Children of the Forest comes from bonus videos rather than reading the books. The children were the original inhabitants of Westeros, the natives, if you will. However, they were described as not human, as some sort of elf-like species that looked like children, and they had some magical powers. They were brought to the brink of extinction by humans that later populated Westeros, and in fact are generally believed to have gone extinct. Many people who live in the southern parts of Westeros don't even believe they ever existed. They think they're just legend, where people in the north believe that they existed once but think that they're now extinct. The children are said to have enhanced the wall with some magical abilities so that the White Walkers cannot pass. Also, they're said to have destroyed the land bridge that used to connect Westeros to Essos. So the fact that Bran actually meets one of them that's alive, it's a huge deal. The children were the ones who had the ability to warg into other animals and to do the green thing, like seeing into the future like Jojen did. But these abilities were said to have somehow transferred to some humans, but it was extremely rare in humans where it was commonplace in the Children of the Forest. So I could see why they'd be very important to Bran's storyline, and to actually see one and to get confirmation that they still existed was a huge deal, and I can't wait to see where they go with this. So overall, I love the scene, and I have to say it's one of my favorite of the whole series. Okay, so next we get into this scene I had a huge problem with, and that's the big battle between Brienne and the Hound, which is a gigantic departure from the books. But, you know, it should be clear by now that I don't mind when the show goes in a different direction from the books. In fact, many instances I prefer the show's changes. However, in this case, I don't think it really worked. It was almost seemed to me, it was like the writers got stoned one night and were like, hey man, you know what would be really cool? If Brienne fought the Hound. Yeah man, that'd be awesome, let's do it! And what I mean by that is it doesn't really serve any storytelling purpose other than to be cool. In fact, other than the first episode, the entire Hound and Arya storyline this season seemed completely unnecessary and just a way to appease the fans. I heard another reviewer refer to this storyline as fan service, and I have to agree with that. I think the biggest piece of fan service was the fight between Brienne and the Hound. Yeah, I thought the fight was kind of cool, and I liked to watch it, but ultimately I think it was a huge hand job to the fans and didn't really serve the story. I think Brienne's storyline would have been much better served introducing this character whom the producers now say they're not going to be introduced, and yes, I'm still very bitter about that. Now, where that scene was an example of how the show deviated to the books to negative effect, the next scene in which Arya leaves the Hound for dead is an example of the show following the books too closely. This scene played out almost exactly the way it did in the books, and I think that was a mistake. I think the show had changed the fundamental nature of Arya and the Hound's relationship, so this scene should have been changed as well. In the books, the scene takes place after that scene that was in episode 1 where the Hound attacks some Lannister men, including Pulliver, at the end. He receives wounds from that battle, which he eventually succumbs to, and that's when Arya leaves him for dead. So in the books, Arya and Hound never built this relationship that they do in the show. In fact, they are a lot more adversarial to each other throughout than they ever were in the show. So Arya leaving the Hound for dead makes perfect sense in the books, but in the show, it just doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, when the Hound says to Arya, "You remember where the heart is," I thought for sure that she would kill him then. That would have made a lot more sense for her storyline, because it would be the student showing the teacher what she'd learned, and she could at the same time scratch a name off her list while respecting the mentor that took care of her. So it would be like a double-edged sword. I thought it would be a really cool thing to do. But this leaving him for dead makes absolutely no sense in the context of the show. This is a clear-cut case of what works for the books doesn't always work for the show, and they should have deviated. In fact, I'm totally convinced now that the Hound is still alive and will be vital to the storyline sometime in the future, because there had to be some reason why they wouldn't show the Hound dying, because that would have made a lot more sense for the story in the show. In fact, the fact that she did not kill him and was kind of just a bitch and left him there did several things. It invalidated their entire storyline for this whole season, rendering it pointless, and it made me think less of Arya's character, and therefore I'm less interested in what she does in the future. Also, it makes no practical sense that she wouldn't go with Brienne. In the books, she has no other option but to go paddling off by herself until she comes across a boat. But here, her best option is clearly to go with Brienne, whom we see from the conversation earlier that she really admires. And, they show her smiling big time when Brienne talks about how awesome she is with the sword. And the fact she managed to take down the Hound, that should have endeared her more to Arya. It seems like the only reason she didn't go with Brienne is because the showrunners knew she needed to go to Braavos instead, which of course makes no logical sense. Of course, the whole conundrum could have been avoided if they never introduced this silly fight scene in the first place. Also, after the fight, Brienne is off looking for Arya. Why she doesn't check by the Hound's body? I don't know. It seems like that would be a logical first place to check. And even if she didn't check there, she would have heard the Hound shouting, "Kill me!" and realized he was talking to Arya and would have been able to find her then. Again, the reason she didn't is because the writers knew that Arya needed to get on the boat to Braavos. So this whole sequence struck me as sloppy writing, plain and simple. Alright, so next we get to the sequence with Tyrion's great escape. This has been altered from the books as well, and I heard some people complaining about this, but I actually thought this was handled extremely well. I love this sequence. However, the way that Jaime and Tyrion parted was a massive change from the books, and in the books they parted in anger. Jaime was only helping Tyrion because he felt guilty, not because he cared about him. And what he felt guilty over was the fact that he lied to Tyrion about his first wife, whom he told Tyrion was a whore, and apparently she wasn't. So when Tyrion finds this out, he's super pissed at Jaime. He tells Jaime about who Cersei's fucking, and he tells Jaime that he did kill Joffrey, which of course is a massive change, which may affect the story even more down the line, because in the books Jaime and Tyrion despise each other, and Tyrion has all but promised to kill Jaime if he ever saw him again. But in the show, they kiss and they hug and they still love each other. I do prefer the show's version of events, and I do think this is how they should have handled this, but it's going to be a massive change. Could potentially be a massive change down the line. There are several reasons why the storyline with his first wife Tysha wouldn't work in the show, because I've heard some people complaining about it, saying that they wish it was there. First of all, it's referring to something that occurred before the show began, that was only mentioned in season 1, and which the average audience member would not remember at all. Also, the show clearly established that Jaime and Tyrion have a very close, loving relationship that obviously didn't exist in the books. And on top of that, Tyrion is a very different character in the show than he was in the books. He's not nearly as likable as he is in the show. He's much more noble and much more of a nice guy in the show. And that's why, in the books, when he gets so angry at Jaime, it just wouldn't fit in the show because, they created a different character. As for Tyrion's encounter with Shae, right before this episode aired, I read the part in the books where he killed Shae, and the first thing I remember thinking is that they better not do the same thing in the show, otherwise I'd be very upset. Because Shae was not at all the same character in the books. In fact, I'd say there are two completely different characters. In fact, the Shae in the show shouldn't even be called Shae. They should have thought of a different name for her because she's a completely different person. Throughout the season, I was wondering how they would handle this scene, since they so drastically changed Shae's character in the show. And not only that, as I mentioned before, they changed Tyrion's character as well, to where I didn't think the scene would work for the show at all. I speculated that perhaps they would have Tywin kill Shae, and that's what would drive Tyrion to kill Tywin. But they followed the books a lot more closely than I would have thought. However, I do think that the way they did it really worked, and I'm very happy with it. First of all, the Shae in the show is much stronger, much more aggressive character, so it makes sense that she would try to kill Tyrion as soon as she saw him. And as for Tyrion, in the books he simply walks up and murders her. But in the show, it was more of a self-defense, heat of the moment type thing. Also in the books, it's clear that she never cared about him and was just using him. Whereas in the show, it was clear that they did love each other, which brought a huge tragic element to her death. It was obvious that it pained Tyrion to kill her, and it was half self-defense, half sort of anger at being betrayed. But it really worked for the show. Basically, what the show set up was a Shakespearean type tragedy, similar to Romeo and Juliet, or Hamlet or something like that, where someone has a plan to set things right, and that plan completely ends up backfiring and screwing them. This starts earlier in the season when Tyrion hears Shae is in danger and wants her to leave the city, but she won't listen to him. So to get her to leave, he breaks up with her and calls her a whore and says all this stuff that he doesn't really mean, just to scare her off and get her to go away. But after he's accused of murder, she's kept in the city to testify against him, and because she believes so fully that he never loved her, she feels betrayed, and she returns the favor full soul, and she goes back to being a whore, basically, and this time for Tyrion's father. So when they see each other again in their father's bed, they both feel betrayed and afraid of each other, and they end up fighting to the death, in which Tyrion wins. All because Tyrion's plan to save her life backfired in the most tragic way. I love the way that worked out. I think it was a brilliant adaptation of the book. If they would have flat out adapted directly from the book, had Tyrion just go up and kill her, it would have made no sense, just like the Hound thing. But the way they made these minor changes, I think, was an improvement on the book. I really liked it. So next, Tyrion goes to confront his father. I've heard a few book readers say they're a bit confused as to why, since in the books his motivation was because he was angry about what he had learned about his first wife and wanted to confront Tywin about that. But in the show, that storyline doesn't exist. But I think it's pretty clear in the show why it is. They've been setting up the struggle between Tyrion and Tywin since season 3, and how all Tyrion wants is his father's love, and Tywin's made it clear that he'll never get it. And also basically that Tywin wants Tyrion dead, or never thought he should have lived in the first place. Also on top of that, the fact he gave this death sentence and was going to kill him, that's something that Tyrion was kind of pissed off about. And then, of course, the fact that he found his lover in his father's bed. In fact, somewhere Tyrion probably blames his father for Shae's death, because it was him who turned her against him and made her testify against Tyrion. And on top of that, he was sleeping with her. So when Tyrion first went up to Tywin's bedchamber, I think his intention was to confront Tywin, but after Tyrion killed Shae, I think his intention was to kill Tywin, plain and simple, because he was blinded by rage and grief. So I totally understand why they changed the focus from Tysha to Shae when Tyrion confronts Tywin, because Tyrion's relationship with Shae is so much more significant in the show than it was in the book. And that's what got Tyrion so broken up and upset. So I think it made perfect sense, and it worked beautifully. So in the show, Tywin tries to placate Tyrion to get him to put down the crossbow, whereas in the book, he has more of a, "You're not going to kill me, you little shit," kind of attitude. Whereas here, he's more like, "Kill you? Of course I wasn't going to kill you. What are you, crazy? Nah, why don't you put down that crossbow? We'll grab some beer, we'll watch some football. It's all good, man." Which probably makes more sense. It's a smarter move, trying to manipulate him rather than antagonizing him. And the show has established that Tywin is a very smart character. But it didn't work out so well for him this time. Though I've seen some people speculating on whether or not Tywin was telling the truth, and of course he wasn't. That stuff he said about not killing Tyrion was 100% pure grade A bullshit to keep him from getting shot with a crossbow. That's all there was to it. I don't think Tywin really wanted him dead, but he was going with the flow at that point. I'm sure Tywin's attitude after Tyrion turned down his generous offer to go to the wall was like, "Well, fuck you then. You made your bed, now go lie in it. I gave you the opportunity to survive, but you had to go throw it away in this combat, which you lost. Now it's your fault. Deal with the consequences." But of course he's not going to say all this to Tyrion while he's pointing a crossbow at his face. Another change from the book that I liked was how Tyrion shot Tywin twice. In the book it was only once. That scene, there was something that seemed a bit more badass about reloading and shooting again to make sure that Tywin had no chance of survival. Anyway, I'm surprised I haven't seen any jokes comparing Tyrion saying "say whore again" to Pulp Fiction, where Samuel L. Jackson does that whole "say what again." This reminded me so much of that. Tyrion should have been like, "say whore again, say whore one goddamn more time," or could have even said, "what do I look like to you, a bitch?" Anyway, so next we have Varys helping Tyrion get away. This is also a change from the books, because Varys is doing this because, he's Tyrion's friend, whereas in the books, Jaime forced him at sword point to do this. So it's not his own decision, but I kind of feel bad for Varys, because he was trying to do Tyrion a solid, and because Tyrion killed Tywin, now he's fucked and can't go back to King's Landing, so he lost everything just because he was trying to help out a friend. Although another interpretation that I heard was that Varys turned around and got back on the boat is because he knew Cersei would now be in charge and he didn't want to have to deal with her. I preferred that interpretation of events, because it doesn't make me feel bad, for Varys. However, I do think, him disappearing right at the same time that Tyrion escapes and Tywin is killed is going to look very suspicious. By doing that, he's pretty much guaranteeing that they'll know that he helped Tyrion escape. But if he had stayed, he probably would be able to bullshit his way out of it. But I like the Cersei theory better, so I'll just go with that. So we get the final scene of Season 4 where Arya boards the boat to Braavos by revealing her coin. As a book reader, I love this scene. It played out just like it did in the books. But unlike the Hound being left for dead scene, it actually works in the show. But as a show watcher, my main complaint about the scene was it took so long to get to. They sort of were setting up the fact that Arya has this coin and she wants to go to Braavos to reconnect with Jaqen H'ghar since the end of Season 3, and we have to wait until the end of Season 4 before she even leaves for Braavos. I would have much rather that she left for Braavos in Episode 4 rather than wasting all this time dicking around with the Hound, which was rendered meaningless in this episode anyway. So I thought her whole storyline was very poorly handled this season, but I liked the scene. I thought it really worked. However, it wouldn't be my choice for a final scene of Season 4. In that regard, it was kind of disappointing because Season 1 ended with this awesome birth of the dragon. Season 2 ended with the White Walkers charging the camp. So they both had epic endings. Whereas Season 3 just had Daenerys crowd surfing with a bunch of dudes calling her mother. That was a huge letdown after the first 2 seasons. So I thought they were going to end with something special this year to make up for it. But no, instead we just get Arya going to Braavos, which is kind of cool, but not Birth of the Dragons or White Walker invasion cool. So it's a shame Game of Thrones kind of ended that tradition of, having a spectacular season endings. Oh well. So that's my review for the Season 4 finale. I'll be doing several Season 4 wrap-up videos as well, and some Season 5 prediction videos, so keep an eye out for that, and thanks for watching.